Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to what promises to be a really interesting webinar hosted by Gradcore on what does the data tell us about how best to prepare and support students moving into the world of work. And I'm delighted that Helen Liddle is going to take us through today's presentation, and that we also have Ali Orr from Kingston University, who's going to bring to life some of the work that they've been doing in collaboration with Gradcore. Helen, I'll pass to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Georgia. Okay, yes, so thank you for joining us this morning. We're going to be delving into some assessment centre data. Okay. I'm Helen, the University Partnerships Director at Gradcore, and yes, Ali, the Director of Student Development, will be joining me from Kingston University. There will be opportunity to ask us questions at the end. Please feel free to post some questions in the chat as we're going along, and we'll pick them up a bit later. You've also got our LinkedIn details there as well, so feel free to connect in with us too. So a little bit about us at Gradcore, if you haven't heard of us before. We're a social enterprise, and we've been working with universities for over 20 years, helping to create strategy and to deliver and embed various recruitment and employability initiatives. We also work with a number of employers, helping them to recruit and retain the best and most diverse talent. And this informs our work with universities, where ultimately it's all about helping those students and graduates secure the best possible outcomes. We're also part of a much wider organisation called the Unseen Group, and that's a collection of companies looking to transform and improve the early career space. And as part of that, we work alongside our sister company, TopScore. And TopScore is an award-winning assessment centre platform, and it's used by a lot of employers to run assessment centres. So you can see some of the points that we'll be covering as part of this morning's session, and just to give some context around that as well. So at Gradcore, we're often consulted on how best to support different groups of students and graduates. We're asked questions around what are employers looking for? How can we increase the confidence of graduates applying for roles and starting new jobs? How can we ensure that they meet employer expectations? And we know that in particular, with regards to that last question, it can be a source of tension for employers, where perhaps graduates aren't seen to be as career ready as they should be. They haven't got enough of an understanding of their strengths and development areas. And one of the ways in which we try to address that at Gradcore is by offering assessment centres. Now, probably what's commonly known is that assessment centres are a very important selection tool. Certainly a lot of the ISE members are using those assessment centres as a key part of their recruitment process. And even where you've got those smaller businesses that perhaps haven't got a formal assessment centre as such, they're still using the types of exercises, groups and presentations that are associated with those types of events. What's perhaps less commonly known is that assessment centres are a very important developmental tool as well. And they can really be used to help develop students' understanding of how to apply and practice different competencies and skills. Now, we run a lot of assessment centre experiences in the universities, where not only are they a good opportunity for experiential learning, they're also giving a very accurate readout of student performance, tracking that against those key competencies and skills that employers are looking for. There's a lot of data out there with regards to recruitment and selection processes. There's a lot of research, a lot of blogs and so on about assessment centres. But in today's session, we wanted to look at data from both employer events and from our university experiences, and to kind of draw some parallels between both of them. And as I say, we'll be looking at some common trends. We'll be exploring the most commonly assessed competencies as part of that. We've got that fantastic case study from Ali, looking at how they've embedded that into the curriculum. We'll look at our assessment centre experiences for universities, and in particular, explore some of that self-assessment, how students rate themselves, comparing their perceptions to how they actually score in employer events and university events as well. So with regards to employers' assessment centres, so this is data pulled from our sister company TopScore, and it's from their assessment centres last year. It's roughly about 3,900 assessment centres and about 58,500 candidates. And we've grouped that data into the different industries, where you can see most of it is coming from energy and engineering industry, followed by legal, and then charity and the public sector. So let's have a look at some of the headlines with regards to that. So TopScore is a digital assessment centre platform, and because of that, the majority of the events are held online. But actually, there was quite a sizable group that were done in person, and still a sizable group as well that were using a hybrid format. So we were able to look across all three of those formats and to compare the kind of average number of exercises that employers were doing as part of that. Now, there's a couple of exceptions where energy, engineering industry, on average, have got about 5 exercises for their in-person events. Charity and public sector, just that one key session. But on the whole, across those 3 different formats, it's about 3 exercises that a candidate could expect to do in an assessment centre. And those core exercises are probably, as you'd expect, interview, group and presentation. And that tallies up with ISE data, where I think the most recent research showed, 87% of employers, or 84%, sorry, are using interviews, 67% group and 66% presentations. Now, another question we wanted to explore is candidate performance affected by holding that assessment centre in different formats? And as you can see on the screen here, not so much. And this might surprise some of you, and I'd be keen to see actually in the audience if this fits with what you'd expect, because some of the conversations I've had with early careers leaders is that they expected the in-person scores to be quite different, perhaps because, face-to-face interviews are affected that bit more by subjective impressions and so on. But actually, as you can see here from our data, very marginal differences. And I think this is a really positive thing. It's quite reassuring because it shows that assessment centre process is, quite robust, quite consistent across the different formats. From an employer's perspective, it means when you're planning your assessment centres, you don't need to worry so much about how that delivery mode is going to affect scores. You can focus on other factors such as candidate experience, engagement, budget, accessibility, and so on. And from a university's perspective, it means that, you can run those assessment centres in those different formats and you can still get that accurate readout of a candidate's performance. Now, we actually ran some assessment centres recently for some business school students. Some were done in person and some were done online because of those students being based in Mumbai. It was the same degree programme, same kind of cohort. And yes, the scores were broadly consistent despite it being that different format. So looking at the most commonly assessed competencies, now we know that can be a bit of a blurred area. Some competencies, some terms are used interchangeably with others. There is that debate around whether to talk about competencies, skills, strengths, attributes, values, for example. For the purposes of this webinar, we're going to be talking mainly about competencies in terms of the employer's data. And by that, we mean kind of specific characteristics and qualities that make someone more efficient in the workplace. Now, TopScore's data is very specific to assessment centres for early career candidates. And you can see there, communications coming out on top, followed by collaboration. But if we look beyond that to kind of other studies, to research in, wider skills in the workplace, Indeed, Manpower survey, you can see a lot of common ground there between the 3, and communication and collaboration featuring quite strongly across all of them. What's perhaps a bit more surprising is that some of those competencies, agility, creativity, problem solving, yes, they've made the top 10, but they're quite far down that list, which, perhaps surprising considering the evolving nature of the workplace. But we very much think that this is set to change. And this fits with a study from the World Economic Forum done in April last year, where they were exploring how the importance of skills will increase from 2023 to 2027. And you can see there again some common ground: motivation, self-awareness, that emotional intelligence piece, yes, still very important and set to increase. But that creative thinking, it's jumped right to the top of that list. It's going to be 73% more important going forward. You can also see some of those other skills creeping in there around, systems thinking, AI and big data. No surprises there. A little bit of a watch out in terms of the technical elements of that. We know that if someone's going to learn a computer program, shelf life of that's probably around about 18 months or so. And some of the conversations we've been having with employers are behind all of these competencies is that need, that emphasis for candidates to be able to learn and adapt, to be agile. There's certainly some of the things coming through first and foremost. Now at Gradcore, we do stay very close to these changes. We want to make sure that our events reflect what employers are assessing, the needs of the labour market, and we also work with a lot of universities to help embed these competencies and attributes into the curriculum so that students have that understanding. But let's look on to see how those competencies are assessed across the top 5 industries. We're just looking at the top 4 competencies here. No surprises that communication is the most assessed competency across all of those 5 industries. But there is some variance in terms of what's assessed the most following that. Energy, engineering and industry, they're looking very closely at collaboration. And again, when we did some focus groups around this, around why that was the case, some of the leaders were saying, collaboration is kind of key to breakthroughs in engineering. They actually see it as the starting point from which other competencies can follow on. It leads to more effective problem solving and decision making. And there's a lot of focus on kind of interdisciplinary working in that sector. When we look at charity and public sector, they're assessing self-awareness following that communication piece. And again, you'd probably expect that in terms of them having to empathise that bit more, working in those pressured, stressful environments, and a lot of leaders in the public sector having to communicate messages that resonate with their all different audiences and so on. And then the finance and professional services sector, after communication, they're very focused on assessing motivation. And that could be because it's a more target-driven environment, kind of keeping yourself motivated to achieving those deadlines and targets there. We then looked at how candidates are scoring. Now, we are going to go on to look at how they score against the different competencies, but grouping this by industry at this initial stage, you can see how that translates. Now, the employers are using a lot of different scoring scales. So we had to normalise those scores to make for a meaningful comparison, which is why you can see it here in percentages. And actually, there is a fairly consistent performance there across the top 5 competencies. And probably the most noticeable gap to pick up on is that difference between legal, scoring the highest there at 71%, compared to candidates from the charity and public sector scoring around 57%. Now, my thoughts around that would be, legal candidates are perhaps that bit more prepared for corporate recruitment processes, perhaps even for assessment centres as well. But again, interested to get your thoughts on why you think that's the case and why that charity public sector is just a little bit below that line there. We can look at this a bit further and look at the average scores for those competencies within each sector. And see some differences there. So legal is the only sector where candidates are scoring above that 70% for motivation and self-awareness. Thinking about that energy and engineering industry, self-awareness, the score for that is much lower than the other areas as part of those employer assessment centres, which is quite interesting. And in the charity and the public sector, candidates are underperforming in comparison to the other sectors and actually to the other competencies as well for communication, which is, as I say, one of their most important assessed competencies. So a possible development area there. And we can use this as a bit of a guide. So when we are supporting students and graduates, depending on which industry they want to work in, we can kind of direct our efforts and shape our events around what is being most commonly assessed here and how they have scored. But it is just a guide only, because we know that employers have different definitions of some of those competencies, and alongside that, different interpretations of what good looks like as well. So far, we've seen that assessment centres are an important selection tool. We've seen that employers are assessing a lot of the same kind of competencies, regardless of role or industry. And we've seen that typically candidates are scoring around the 60% mark, if not above, or just a little bit below. But how can we really improve students' understanding of those areas? How can we ensure that they're achieving above and beyond that 60%? Well, I'm now going to hand you over to Ali, who's going to show you how they have identified some of those key attributes and how they have embedded them into the curriculum.
Thanks very much, Helen, and good morning, everybody. My name's Ali. I'm the Director of Student Development and Graduate Success, so I oversee the team at Kingston University that is responsible for supporting students' development, proactive development through the whole student life cycle. That includes sort of careers, employability, enrichment, study abroad, and so on. I'm also the workstream co-lead for our strategic future skills programme, which is what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today. Can you move the slide on? Thanks. So future skills is really at the heart of our university strategy, which was launched back in 2022. And it's hard. It's about ensuring that the graduate attributes, which I'll talk a little bit to you about, are explicitly developed and assessed for all students in their course. And I think a lot of institutions, most institutions, have some sort of graduate attributes framework. We've had one traditionally. A piece of institutional research that I led back in 2021 found that even though we had graduate attributes, in a survey of course leaders, only 20% of courses actually assessed the attributes in any meaningful way. So what's the point of having graduate attributes if you're not really using them and bringing them to life? The attributes are based on some extensive work that we've done with industry over the past 3 years. We published our third iteration of our Future Skills report back in December. We've partnered with YouGov to survey 2,000 businesses a year to identify what the top 10 future skills will be. Our graduate attributes are derived from those top 10 future skills. They're very similar to the sort of things that Helen's talked about, to the World Economic Forum list, to a lot of the things that you'll be familiar with. I think what's really critical, there's a sort of element of so what to what I've said so far, but what's really important is that we're supporting students all the way through their time with us to develop and to be able to articulate those graduate attributes and really translate them into different contexts, which is going to be of great importance for their careers, but also for their future lives more generally. Next slide. And the other thing about Future Skills, it's a holistic, consistent programme that will reach all students. And I'll sort of take you through our timeline for that, which is very ambitious and exhausting timeline, but one which means that we are scaling this, and we are focusing on the equity aspect and ensuring that we are delivering to all students the sort of value, the value added that's often missed out by students who can't fully engage in the extracurricular. So that's a traditional model of higher education where we know higher education is really good at developing the attributes. It's not necessarily always in the course where those attributes are developed. It's that whole like wraparound experience. The way that our students in particular at Kingston, but students increasingly across the sector, in the context of cost of living crisis, in the context of having far more commuting students, students with caring responsibilities and so on, it's really absolutely essential that we have, we really rethink our model of how we're delivering those attributes. And it's about empowering students to be reflective and adaptive learners. I think in the context of what's been quite a hostile policy environment for universities, where there's been a lot of discussion of low value courses that don't provide return on investment for students and so on. I think for us, what's really critical is that by embedding the graduate attributes throughout all of our programs, students should be able to follow their interests and study whatever subject they want to, and still graduate with these future skills, which will stand them in really good stead. In a labour market where employers are sort of more than ever telling us that they need those transferable skills, those transversal skills, those future skills. Next slide. And these are our graduate attributes. And so again, there's probably no great surprises among them. They're very much based on what employers have consistently told us across industries that they need. But these are also sort of higher level. I think we're talking about attributes. We're talking about not just being able to do something in the sort of once in a confined environment. These are attributes that you can actually take with you through different contexts. We know students are increasingly going to have multiple careers, portfolio careers, non-linear careers. They're going to transcend sectors, and actually being able to reapply your attributes across those different sectors is going to be really critical as well. Okay, next slide. I mentioned that it's a really rapid timeline that we're working to. And I think that again comes back to, we know that this is critically important for all students. We started from a point where effectively we hadn't embedded future skills into any program fully. And we wanted to get to every single program. So we've adopted an approach of prototyping in a small group of courses with a sort of small subset of students, our approach, and then rolling that out to the whole of the year group. So last year, sort of roll back 18 months, we were just really kicking off. We had 5 prototype courses running in first year. We reached about 2% of our undergraduate students. Fast forward to today, and we're in the middle of our sort of first full year of future skills at level 4 or first year. So our Navigate modules are embedded into every program. And that means alongside the prototypes that we're running in second year, we're now at about 35% of our undergraduate students who have future skills embedded into their programs. That will jump up by September to 70% as we then roll out across all of our second year modules. Actually, we have a meeting in about 40 minutes to approve those module changes for next year. And then fast forward to 18 months from now, and we will have fully embedded into all of our programs, undergraduate programs at all levels. That's a really rapid curriculum transformation across the institution. I don't think that would have been possible if we hadn't sort of already been doing a lot of work in different pockets. So lots of really good practice. We're going to talk a little bit about the assessment centres, which at Kingston started back in 2019, grew from 1 school to 4 schools today. We've got lots of other examples like that where we were doing little bits of good practice, but not consistently, not for every student and not every year. So it's about turning that into a sort of consistent development programme where we're really foregrounding the graduate attributes in everything that we do. Next slide. So that's sort of, these are the learning outcomes. And I think it's that thing that one of the things we know from a sort of litany of different approaches across the sector is that really if it's not assessed, then it didn't happen as far as students are concerned. And so we're really adamant and really intentional that in embedding into curriculum, we have to have learning outcomes. They have to be mandatory. They have to be in core modules. And so we have this sort of dual approach. So we have learning outcomes, which every single student will have to meet as part of their programs. These are credit-bearing modules, and they're focused on sort of self-development and articulation, and on the development of skills and attributes, the graduate attributes in different contexts. And you can see across the 3 different levels. If you have a Swiftie in your family, you'll understand what I'm saying. We talk about these as our eras as well. So like you go into your Navigate era, and that's very much about building your own sense of belonging, your identity within the institution, starting to sort of get your head around what personal development means, and an introduction of the graduate attributes in the context of your discipline. As you move into the Explore era or into the second year, it's then much more about starting to be able to critically evaluate your development and using the graduate attributes to explore beyond your discipline. So it's kind of moving beyond, outside of your comfort zone. And so by the time that students move into their final year or into their apply era, then we expect to be able to see that very much more action-orientated, goal-setting, clear idea about their development and how to get there. And in terms of how they're using the graduate attributes and demonstrating the graduate attributes, it's about, again, sort of starting to think about more complex challenges that go beyond the university and not just beyond the discipline. Those are the intended outcomes that we have for students at each level. And then if we go into the next slide, it's sort of then how do we structure the program? How do we structure the module to enable students to actually get there and meet those learning outcomes? So what we've done is delivering a series of personal development workshops in curriculum. Those are sort of co-designed and co-delivered between academics and my own team. Part of that includes a student's self-assessment, so a tool that we call Skills Pulse, where students are given statements relating to the graduate attributes and asked to self-assess their confidence that they can do those things, or that they have those attributes. And that generates a score, that generates some really valuable data points for students at each level. And as the programme develops, obviously we're going to get some really, really rich data, and there's a whole research project in that. And we do actually have a research fellow that we've appointed to work alongside us, so that we're actually starting to look at asking all the right questions about what's the impact of the different approaches that we take across different modules on students' own learning and students' own development of the attributes. The other aspects that I think are really important to flag up, in first year, it is very much about doing this alongside the subject, about making it feel part and parcel of the subject. I think students and academics both resist anything that looks like a bolt-on and feels like it doesn't belong in the course, and engagement tends to be low as a result of that. And we've seen that at Kingston and across the sector as well. So that subject contextualization, I think, is really critical, and it's also been really invaluable in securing the buy-in of our academic colleagues, without whom none of this would be possible. As we go into level 5, this is where we've traditionally embedded our assessment centres, which I say have expanded out to 4 of our schools. We've got 11 schools across the institution. We already have assessment centres embedded in 4 of them. From next year, we're expanding that out, so every single student will have an experience of an assessment centre simulation. I think Helen's point at the start is, we've seen immense value in their role as developmental opportunities, as experiential learning opportunities, as authentic assessment opportunities for students. They've got a huge amount out of them. What we're really keen to do, though, as part of the Explore second year programme, is to sort of attach these to an Explore experience. So the experience will be a period of experiential learning, industry relevant learning that students will do on their course. And following that, they will go into their assessment centre. So that every student, even if they've got no prior work experience, will have something meaningful that they can reflect on and demonstrate and sort of present back in the assessment centre. So again, it's sort of levelling that up for students who might otherwise come into those assessment centres really quite cold in terms of having examples to be able to draw on, and linking that through really intentionally for students across their programme. I'll say a little bit quickly on the final year, which we're still building, but we'll be prototyping from September. And really what we want to do as students that have come out of their second year, they come out of the assessment centre where they get some really detailed feedback, and where we've worked with Gradcore on the day feedback, read out against how they've performed. They're comparing that back against their skills pulse, their own self-assessment. And we think that there's real value in sort of comparing across the two in building students' self-awareness, but also then giving them the opportunity to apply that into their own development plans. So in the final year of the course, we want to ensure that there are opportunities for students to really target their own development around a particular competence or attribute. Say I might need to sort of top up my digital competency, or I may need to really work on my creative problem solving, for example. And there'll be a range of different experiences that they can pick from that align to those particular attributes. And then next slide. Is there a next slide? That's it. I was like, did I have anything else to say? That's really where we're at to date. And I think sort of we see that assessment centre experience sort of right at the heart of the student journey as being quite a critical point, really, because up until then it has been quite self-contained. Often they won't have really gone out into workplaces. It's quite a key moment for students, I think, where we see it has quite a deep impact on their learning. And then what we want to now do is sort of connect that back up to the remainder of their course and ensure that they're able to use that as a transformative experience and sort of push them in the right direction.
Thanks very much, Ali. Just sort of a couple of questions off the back of that for you. And as I say, there'll be opportunity for the audience to ask questions at the end as well. You started to talk about some of the rich data that you were getting from the pulse surveys, from the assessment centres. What are your kind of long-term aspirations? When that level 6 is fully embedded across all the schools, what your aspirations with regards to how you can use that data going forward?
Yeah, so I think the value of the data is at both individual level and then sort of cohort level and actually whole institutions. So sort of on an individual basis, you know, students have access to their own data, their own results. They can see how those sort of their confidence in their own self-assessment is going up or going down, and we can then sort of use that to signpost them to particular support or particular activities which will help them in that respect. I think then, you know, that data can then be shared with people like personal tutors and in terms of supporting and the sort of scaling of the support as well. Alongside that, I think some of the cohort level data is really, really valuable to understand what is the impact of some of the stuff that we're embedding into curriculum. So I talked about explore experiences. Every course is going to have an explore experience. That's going to look quite different in different ways. We will get readout like at the end of that on whether students feel that that they've actually grown in their graduate attributes, that they're more confident in holding their those graduate attributes on the back of some of those activities. So it's a really useful evaluation tool. It's not the whole picture, but it's a really, really important insight. And then at whole institution level, I think just thinking about some of the challenges around different student groups, different demographics. Do we see any sort of top level trends? Also against different subjects. You shared some of that data. I thought that was really interesting. The bit around self-awareness in energy and in engineering sort of like made me smile a little bit. It doesn't surprise me massively when you think about what employers in those sectors have been saying for years and years. But actually to be able to compare in particular subjects, are we seeing students actually being able to grow in their own development of key competencies? So I think that that data has multiple benefits for us, which we just need to there's work still to do to sort of fully reap those benefits and to be really properly data informed. But it's there and the opportunities are there, and we want to use that more and more.
Great, thank you. And you talked about the assessment centre started in 2019 from 1 school up to 4, and some of the other interventions from your careers team. How easy has it been to scale that up over those years and to continue to scale it up?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously looking at the assessment centres and then more widely how we're scaling up the whole of future skills, I think that if we just began in 2022, there's absolutely no way that we'd have made the progress that we have over the last 18 months. So I think it's very much about the partnerships that we've built with academic teams, with faculties, and the sort of infrastructure that we've put together within our own team to allow us to do that. And so I think where you create the right conditions, the right environment for that partnership, it's then easier to take more risks. It's then easier to do things that they haven't done in the past. And in terms of the assessment centres, I think then the role of yourselves in supporting academics as well in understanding the value and talking them through and really contextualising it. So it's worked because it's linked to assessment. I think it will work even better in future because it's coming out of the back of the Explore experiences. I think we're doing some even next month where students have worked on a project and they're taking some of that into their assessment centre experience. So I think that becomes more authentic as well. It's been challenging. It will be challenging, I think, as we take it to the next level. We'll be going into far less obvious subjects where, in the past, a lot of assessment centres across the sector happen in business schools. But actually the conversations we've had with each of our academic schools, everyone sees the value of this as a developmental tool, as part of that experiential learning. It's just to ensure that that's really nuanced and contextualised for the students and for the academics as well. And language becomes a bit of a challenge too. We talk about assessment centres, and some of that's challenging in the context of assessment has a particular connotation for academics and for their students, but also we've had suggestions that we dress it up as something else, and so that's actually the worst thing that we can do, because students need to know that this is actually a simulation of something that's called an assessment centre. So when they find themselves called to an assessment centre, they recognise that they've actually been there and done it. That sounds really obvious, but actually students don't always join the dots. So we need to do that as well.
Yeah, make it really explicit. Yeah, I agree. I mean, we've looked at how candidates are scoring in some of the top industries, and we're going to go on to look at how they score against the competencies and how they rate themselves as well, which I know that you're gauging that as part of your pulse surveys too. Thinking about some of the competencies we've looked at, or your 9 attributes, in your opinion, which ones do you think students need the most support with?
That's a great question. I think we're just starting to discuss that really, because we've made, so over the last 18 months, we've made it much more explicit. I think academics are looking across what they do, particularly in those modules. And future skills isn't just in the modules, it needs to live through the course. But I think those sort of module leaders who've been really, really deeply engaged over the last 18 months are looking at, you know, how are students developing those different attributes? Where are they developing those? What are some of the harder attributes to kind of proactively develop? And that tends to be quite course specific as well. So, you know, we've had some areas where I don't know how to develop empathy, for example, and we're sort of working with them to look at different ways of developing empathy. For example, we've had some interdisciplinary projects where students are having to really put themselves in each other's shoes and understand what does your disciplinary context mean about how you approach a particular problem. That's development of empathy right there. And then how do you then extrapolate from that into something that employers are looking for? So I think I don't have like a clear answer about it's this attribute or that attribute. I think it's more that by foregrounding them, we're starting to identify that there are gaps. There are gaps in the sort of the student development journey in terms of where they are exposed to the opportunities to develop the different attributes, particularly if it's going to go beyond the surface level. It can't just be a box ticking thing. It's got to have meaning. But we will, we'll have the data to look at, and obviously again that sort of feedback from academics who are sort of running those modules, which I think will help us massively.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ali. Great. Okay, so moving on to kind of talk about our university assessment centre experiences. So yes, at Gradcore we run a lot of these. They're very much aimed at recreating an employer's assessment centre and providing, that safe environment in which students kind of learn and practice that. They can vary quite considerably, as Ali was saying there, depending on the schools, depending on the needs of the particular cohort, subject area or industry they want to work in, and the objectives of the school or institution as well, where, for example, with Kingston, we have embedded those 9 attributes into the feedback criteria and into all of the exercises as well. We're also keeping a close eye as well on what employers are doing, using some of that data we were looking at from TopScore and feeding that into our assessment centres in terms of what we're assessing and what we're looking at making it as realistic as possible. Now we're going to move on to look at some of the data from our assessment centres, and that's from last year. It's about 114 assessment centres in total for just over 7,000 students and graduates. And we use a lot of this data to benchmark student performance and to help shape decisions around how to support them going forward. And there's lots of different ways in which we could look at this data, to be honest, which we haven't got time to do as part of this session, but we do break it down by subject area, and we break it down by different student characteristics, country of origin, and so on. We can break it down by year groups as well. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're looking at it as an aggregate level. So it will be all of the students, all the graduates and postgraduates that we have worked with over the course of the last year. So in terms of how we approach these assessment centre experiences at Kingston University, as you heard, they are very embedded, and that is definitely the approach that we would push for, because it does have a much more positive impact on attendance and overall engagement. And by embedded as well, I don't just mean timetabled, it is where it is linked to module assessment. And you can see, we've asked students why they attend these events. We survey them before they go. There's various reasons there around, wanting feedback, wanting to develop themselves, but actually a sizable majority there, 72%, are attending because it is a part of their degree programme. And within that 72%, there'll be a core group who just otherwise wouldn't have gone if it hadn't been embedded, because of confidence issues or because they just didn't understand the relevance or value to themselves. So that's why we do spend a lot of time working with academics to make sure that those assessment centres are truly embedded and linked to the learning outcomes of each of the modules there. So in terms of overall impact, looking at it at a high level, we do survey the students both before and after the events, and we're looking at that impact on their confidence. And at the very least, it's a 26% uplift, which is what we're seeing here across all of our events last year. It can be a lot higher than this, particularly for widening participation cohorts, where it can be as much as 65%. And it's having that real impact in terms of how they approach, how they think about applying for those future roles. We also ask the students to self-assess themselves. So alongside Kingston doing those pulse surveys, we ask the students to rate themselves against key competencies. How do they think, how skilled do they think they are against some of those areas? And when we look at this from their pre-responses, so this is before they've gone to the assessment centres, you can see we're using the same competencies that we use as part of Top Scores assessment centres, that communication, self-awareness as part of emotional intelligence, motivation, and so on. And we ask them to rate themselves from highly skilled to not skilled for each of those. They do consider themselves to be relatively well skilled across those 5 areas, coming out quite strong, and they see themselves as particularly skilled at communication and working together. Noticeably less confident about their abilities in commercial awareness. Following the assessment centres, again, that same process, us asking them to rate themselves once they've come out of that event. And broadly speaking, there is an uplift in those who consider themselves highly skilled in those 5 areas. We don't always see that, I should say. Sometimes we have some decreases where they go into the event thinking, oh yes, I totally get emotional intelligence. I know what that's all about. And then afterwards, they've had some feedback, they've had seen some best practice in the area and realise that actually they've got more work to do and they need to follow up on some of those points. So sometimes we can see decreases. But on the whole, again, looking at all of those events, there are those uplifts in how they perceive themselves, which is feeding into that confidence going forward. But a continuing theme there, it's increased, but commercial awareness still the lowest one there in terms of how they rate themselves going forward. We then go on to look at their scores across those 5 competencies. Now, there can be some interesting breakdowns for this when you do look at it by certain student characteristics. But again, looking at that high level, there are marginal differences between the scores across those areas. And yes, communication is coming out on top, which is a good thing because, it's one of the most important, most commonly assessed competencies, as we've seen. And it's followed there by motivation and drive for results. Continued focus area, commercial awareness coming in there at 63%. So this is a definite theme from student perception and from how they're scoring on the day itself. We then make a point of comparing these scores with the student perception. And actually there are quite marginal differences on the whole, they're quite close. But there are still some gaps there, and no surprises there between the gap between perception and score for commercial awareness. Perhaps a bit more so for working together, because the students, they do think quite highly of their ability to work together and to do group work. And a lot of this, I think, is born from the fact that they do a lot of group work at university. Therefore, they think that, this is something that they are more familiar with. And I was struck by one comment from a student who said, after she'd attended our event, I realised there's more to working together than just, team environment. It made me realise that recruiters focus on emotional intelligence alongside other things. So, as I say, some of them do come out and adjust their perceptions accordingly and based on what they've learned from the day. We've then aligned our scores from our university events against those from the employer events. And what you can see here is that there is overall very, very little difference between them. Now, I'm going to acknowledge that the university scores are that bit higher. So for our events, that there is that tendency to score higher for the 5 competencies. But actually, that's because, at Gradcore, we're ultimately trying to create a supportive environment that boosts confidence. And actually, the students haven't got that pressure of an actual job offer at stake. So that's going to have that effect. But overall, they are broadly similar. And I think what this shows is that the university assessment centre experiences can give quite an accurate readout on a student's performance against those exercises and against those competencies. And this is a really important piece of data, as Ali mentioned, about how we can use that, because it can show the distance travelled against those key competencies, and it can be used in conjunction with other sources, so some of those self-assessment surveys, feedback from employers around those competencies as part of work-based projects and placements. And all of that can be joined together to really create a picture, to join up the dots in a student's journey of how they are performing against those key areas. When we kind of align this to some of the data from the ISE, from their most recent student development survey, they asked ISE members, they asked their employers how career ready they thought graduates were against different skills, behaviours, attitudes and values and so on. And the ones here on the screen are where the highest percentage of employers thought that graduates needed the most support. So communication's not here and teamwork's not here, because only a very small percentage of employers thought that that was a development area. What you can see are the areas that perhaps do need that bit more focus. And you've got there commercial awareness, not right at the top, but it's still there with a solid 20% of employers thinking that, you know, graduates aren't quite career ready in this respect. And you've also got self-awareness there coming out quite high at 35% as well. And you could argue that self-awareness, emotional intelligence is perhaps one of the most important competencies. And in our discussions with employers, you know, they see it perhaps as what leads through, what feeds through to some of these other competencies being better, because if they have that self-awareness, that understanding of their strengths and weaknesses, they can perform better across all of the other areas. Just to kind of finish by kind of grouping the data a little bit differently by looking at the exercises themselves. So again, that self-assessment piece, asking students how skilled they think they are across those 3 sessions, the group presentation, the interview. Again, they do consider themselves relatively well skilled in those areas, and they certainly favour the group exercise, which ties in with their confidence in that ability to work together. Following the assessment centres, we continue to see that uplift in how they rate themselves, most noticeably for the group exercise. You know, there's a jump of 21% there, where they're having that confidence uplift. So good to see that that's coming through. And looking at the scores for those exercises from the university events, again, very marginal differences, but actually it's the presentation exercise that students are performing the best at compared to the group task where they think they are that bit better. And again, we always like to do that comparison between perception and performance piece, which is something we feed through to universities as well. And it is very close, you know, virtually bang on with presentation there in terms of how they rate themselves, but still that little gap in perception for the group and the interview. So some possible development areas to focus on there. So just to kind of cover off some of our kind of key points, key summary from what we've looked at as part of today's session. That reinforced point around it not just being a selection tool. Assessment centres are very good at helping students understand how to apply those competencies and what employers are looking for. We looked at the fact the mode of delivery does not on the whole affect candidate performance. You know, employers and universities can focus on other factors, because we're certainly not saying that the format doesn't affect the candidate experience, but it doesn't affect their scores, which is a positive thing. We looked at the fact that most of them have got 3 exercises. You know, employers are broadly using very similar exercises in some case, and certainly the same kind of competencies and attributes as part of that. And what that means, particularly for universities, is that, you know, when they're preparing students from multiple disciplines, you know, it makes it easier to focus on those key competencies ahead of that technical knowledge, which can vary that bit more. We've seen the value of embedding some of these competencies and attributes into the curriculum, and the assessment centres are a good example of that and have proven to increase student confidence there. Students do rate themselves higher than they actually perform. You know, there is that gap in perception, particularly around the areas of group, working together. So interventions like the assessment centre experiences are going to help with that and improve their understanding. And thinking about those focus areas within it, yes, commercial awareness, absolutely, where their confidence and their performance is lower. Group exercise and working together, they are performing better in that, but there's still that gap that you think they're better than they are. And yes, to come back to that point around self-awareness as part of emotional intelligence overall, and how that can often be that first step and having a positive impact on the other competencies. And I noticed in the ISE's, again, development survey, 54% of employers think that graduates are career ready, which is great. But what that does mean is that 46% of them don't. So it's about how these interventions, how we can use things like assessment centres to kind of close that gap and make that an even bigger majority. So I'm coming to an end in terms of taking questions. But I did just want to say as well, we're continuing to measure the data and the impact of what we do as part of these events. And if there was a particular angle that you wanted us to investigate or report back on, so some things we talked about different student characteristics, year groups, subject areas, please get in touch. Please let us know if there's a particular area that you'd like us to follow up upon. But hopefully I've left enough time for a couple of questions there. So please do feel free to ask me or Ali anything you'd like.
Well, firstly, thank you, Helen and Ali, for that really interesting canter through
Yes.
all this wonderful work that's going on and the analysis underpinning it. So thank you both so much. I'm going to start with one of the questions from the audience, actually about group tasks. So thank you, Rachel, for popping this one in the questions for us. Rachel's question is that she's seeing in their group task that the candidates are scoring lower, and that sometimes maybe the candidates are missing the point, working too independently, and sometimes when they think about the apprenticeships, which I appreciate, Ali, is less of your space, maybe the under 18s or even the 16-year-olds really struggling with aspects of what's being asked of them, and just really wanted to know, does that resonate with what you've experienced, and is there any kind of themes within that you've seen?
Yes, I mean, when we saw on some of our slides there that there is that gap, that students think they are better than they are on that group exercise. And yeah, there is that assumption because they are put into these group situations, not by choice, but as part of the curriculum, as part of the degree, that because they've had to be in a group exercise, that they know what they're doing going forward. We find when we're assessing these, both for employers actually and for universities, it's often the same themes coming through. It's some of those basics that are missing. And as Rachel said there, you can set the scene around it being a group exercise. And sometimes, particularly when it's a developmental event, you can actually give them that little bit more coaxing around the fact, reminding them that we are assessing how you work together. But despite that, they will still sometimes go, right, well, shall we break up this brief? I'll take this bit, you take this bit. And yes, they do end up working in isolation. At the university events, we will prompt them after a certain point in time to say, look, this is not what you should be doing. But yes, it is something we're picking up on, where those basics aren't quite in place, and we're giving feedback often around a lot of the same things.
Thanks, Helen. Ali, I don't know if you have anything to add in terms of that particular question.
Not that will help with the sort of under 18s part,
No.
but one of the things I think that's interesting for us is seeing that and seeing the sort of performance in the group tasks, and sort of going back and talking to academic colleagues about how they then approach teamwork and group task exercises in the curriculum, because whatever they're doing clearly isn't actually preparing students in quite the way for performing in that group task. So there's something interesting that we picked up with academics that relates to exactly that point. So our students also sometimes struggle with showing the right competencies through the group tasks. Yeah.
Thank you, Ali, and yeah, I think that's a vital link as well, because obviously these students have been trained to work in certain ways when they're given a project or a task to work on together, and then obviously that's kind of not quite what we're always looking for when we set a group task. We don't automatically want them to go into dividing and conquering. We want them to work together and show that collaboration as well. Thank you both. So another question here from Aaron, which possibly then kind of builds on this theme of how the students are feeling within the environment. So his question is, the term assessment centre often fills students and graduates with anxiety and dread. What would your advice be to help them feel more at ease before attending an assessment centre?
Yeah, so these events that we run, well, if we look at it from the university perspective, or even from an employer's as well, they're not isolated events. There needs to be a lot of activity around them in terms of supporting the students or graduates towards working towards them. Whether that's through comms, sessions with ourselves. We have worked with employers where we've actually kind of run a pre-session to get the graduates in the right mindset for attending that assessment centre, to make sure that potentially more disadvantaged graduates can still contribute to the same level as others who can't. And for universities as well, yes, it's about breaking it down, working with those students to kind of get past that assessment centre barrier. We have been known as well, particularly where the events are extracurricular, it's harder to get them there. And that word assessment can be a barrier to attendance. And to go back to Ali's point, we don't want to obscure what the event is. We want them to know it's an assessment centre, but actually it's more important that we get them there in the first place. And then being able to communicate with them on the day around, what's going to happen. So sometimes we do brand it a bit differently, particularly when it is extracurricular, and we may call it a recruitment experience, for example, because that word assessment can be a bit of a deterrent.
Thanks, Helen.
Yeah, I would just add, when we're embedding into curriculum, we don't just embed the event. We, we're working with the students weeks in advance to really prepare them and assuage a lot of those fears. The peer-to-peer bit works really well. So we've been doing this for several years. So we've got final year students who've been through the experience the previous year and able just to say, like, actually, you don't need to worry about it. It's great. And also to talk about some of the wins. We had a student, like, literally last week just get back in touch to say, I landed an internship off the back. It was all because of my assessment centre experience. And that really helps too.
Brilliant. Well, that's a brilliant example, Ali, of exactly why everyone's so delighted that you're investing in this type of approach, because we want to make sure that students can do their best when they come to the real life assessment centres or assessment process with an employer. Brilliant to hear those success stories coming through. So I think we've got time for one final question, and that is about what the future of assessment centres looks like. Helen and Ali, any kind of crystal ball moments that you'd like to share with the audience in terms of where you think changes might be on the horizon?
I'll go first there, Ali. So yes, I mean, obviously technology is going to have a huge impact on assessment centres. Positive elements to it, embracing VR, more gamified assessment. And I actually think, there's going to be more exercises that will potentially test how a candidate can use AI to do their job as well. It's certainly something that we're looking at. And I think the advent of technology as well, in particular AI, this is real crystal ball. I don't know this for definite, but there are certainly some discussions around employers holding their assessment centres in person a lot more, because it's more of a controlled environment to hold those exercises in if they are worried about AI being used. The other thing I would say is, yes, assessment centres still very much will focus on those skills, those competencies, ahead of technical knowledge in a lot of cases. And something I'm seeing coming through as well is a bit more of an emphasis on self-assessment, which is why it's an important part of our process at Gradcore as well. And certainly one of the employers we're working with, the presentation exercise, it's still scored, but actually the weighting of those scores is diverted more to the reflective piece afterwards, the kind of questions that the students ask, how they reflect on what they would have done differently as part of that presentation, what they learned from it, and that's taken into account as much as, if not more, than their actual delivery of the presentation. So I suppose a bit more of a shift towards looking at that agility, that ability to learn and adapt, and kind of what that looks like in the assessment centres.
Really interesting, Helen. Thank you. Ali, I don't know if you have any final observations on that.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a growing demand for the use of AI that Helen mentioned in the assessment itself. I think great focus on gamified assessment too, but also in terms of assessing AI skills, which I'm hearing from employers a lot more too. So I think that I would agree those are probably the two key trends that I'd expect to see.
Wonderful. Well, we're just about coming to time now, so I'm going to say a huge thank you to Helen and Ali for taking us through the conversation this morning. Thank you, audience, as well, for your participation and all those great questions as well. Helen and Ali, thank you so much again. And I'm now going to say thank you and have a great day, everyone. See you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.